What's the most unforgettable deathbed confession you've ever heard? Story 1. My dad had Alzheimer's and ended up in a secure ward. He was blind and almost deaf. I was visiting him one day. He didn't know who I was, but he started talking about me. He said I had done better than him in life and that he was proud of me. He was a quiet man in real life and never told me that when I was growing up. Looking back, he did things that I never realized were for me. Like when he retired, his colleagues asked what he'd like as a present. He chose a scientific calculator. This was back in the 1970s. He had no use for it. He gave it to me for university. I thought he was just passing it on, not realizing that he'd asked for it with me in mind. Story 2. My great-grandmother lived a very long and interesting life. She was in her 20s during the Great Depression. She had a wild streak from those days that we don't know much about, to the point that we actually don't know our great-grandfather's name, just the husband she took later. Over the course of her nearly 100-year life, she collected owls, literally thousands of owl figurines. She had clocks, wall hangings, pot holders, lamps, stained glass art, salt shakers, and more little figurines than you could imagine, all depicting owls. We all wondered about the importance of the owls. She never talked about them. We just all knew she loved owls. Well, when she was nearing death, at the age of 98 or 99, and the doctors said she had days left, my grandparents went and talked to her. They asked her if she had anything she wanted to share or ask before she passed. She thought for a moment, then said, "I never understood the owls." It turns out she didn't actually care about owls. Near as we could piece together, sometime in the 1940s or 1950s perhaps, she bought either a trivet or a set of salt and pepper shakers shaped like owls. Then someone got her the other. Those were the oldest owls anyone could remember. But from there, someone got her an owl to match, probably a pot holder or placemat. And all of a sudden, her kitchen was owl-themed. From there, it snowballed. The owls flowed like wine, baffling her for 60 years, eventually taking over as the bulk of her personal belongings. Story 3. My grandma suffered from dementia for many years before she passed. It got so bad she didn't remember who her family were, and would barricade herself in her home because she was scared of everyone. She even forgot she smoked and would find her cigarettes months later after forgetting where they were, then claim she was desperate for one. She'd put them away after one, and that would be her again for months. The only memories she had left at the end were that her sister used to be able to play the piano beautifully, and her husband, her childhood sweetheart, was gone, but she didn't know where. He'd died sometime earlier. She spent her days waiting for him to come home from wherever he was. "My John will be home soon," she would say, or someone would walk past the window and she'd double take and say, "Thought that was my John." It was heartbreaking watching her deteriorate until she was on her deathbed, unaware of anything or anyone. I went to say my goodbyes to her in the hospital, and she held my hand and told me how much she loved me, but how she was ready to go be with John now. In that moment, she remembered who I was, what was happening to her, and that her husband, my granddad, had already passed. She went in her sleep not long after that, and I'm forever thankful I managed to say goodbye and tell her how much I loved her too. I've held on to that moment for so long without really processing it, and writing this just tore my heart out. I miss them both so much, but I know they're finally together again somewhere. Story 4. Not my story, but that of a hospice worker who spoke to my class. For those who don't know, hospice is a method of end-of-life care that focuses on alleviating the emotional and physical pain of a dying person to ease their passing, rather than fighting their imminent death. One of her patients was a bedbound woman in her 90s who was generally unresponsive, but had flashes of recognition and engagement. It's hard to gauge the level to which unresponsive patients are detached from their surroundings, so family members are encouraged to stay close in hopes of comforting the patient. Now, this patient was from a U.S. state that prided itself on its state university and the university's football team. The woman's family had attended this university for 4 or 5 generations. During her hospice care, however, her great-granddaughter was the first in their family to decide to go to a different school, the rival state's university, in fact. Her family was supportive of her decision, but often joked about her being the rebel or Judas or something like that. One day, they were all sitting around the woman's bedside, teasing the girl about her decision. Suddenly, the patient sat up, looked at her great-granddaughter, said, "Traitor," and passed away. Story 5. My great uncle actually confessed to having two illegitimate sons right before he passed away, right in front of his own children and grandchildren. The crazy thing was that none of his children knew about this other life of his. Not even my great aunt knew about it, because if she had been alive at the time and found out, she would have made a huge fuss. What was even crazier was that these two sons had already passed away, 5 and 7 years before him, respectively. He was 98 years old, and his invisible sons were 65 and 69 years old. The children later found out that one of these sons had actually been a teacher at the same school his granddaughters attended when they were in high school. Nevertheless, his children decided to reach out to the children of his invisible sons. They got connected and learned more things about my great-uncle. The wildest part? I had actually dated one of the granddaughters of one of the invisible sons, the one who passed away at the age of 69. Story 6. My great-grandfather was in his mid-90s when he died. His health had always been good, but a benign tumor, deemed too dangerous to operate on at his age, went septic. He passed away a week later. I went to visit him in the hospital. My family used to see him a lot, but there had been a falling out between him and my grandma several years earlier, so we stopped visiting. Funny enough, though, I constantly ran into him at the store, and we always had nice chats. Anyway, at the hospital, he told me not to worry about him. Most everyone he had ever known was gone, and he was ready to go too. The week he started feeling sick, he knew something was off and made arrangements to get my great-grandma into a nursing home. He had been taking care of her while she battled Alzheimer's, and he wouldn't let himself die until he knew she was looked after. They were married for over 70 years. My favorite story is that every Sunday for over 50 years, he would drop my great-grandma off at church and then sit in the car waiting for her. He hated religion, but he loved his wife. Story 7. Not exactly a deathbed confession. I was a hospice volunteer and worked with a man who had a brain tumor. He was in decent shape otherwise, but the nursing home was driving him nuts. One day I took him for a ride around town. He had grown up there. It seemed like every other block he would point at an old building and say, "Used to be a place like that there. Empty lot. Used to be a building there, and it had a pretty busy place back in the day." He had a story for every block. We passed by an old, odd-looking apartment building with more doors than it should have, some of which were sealed up. He said, "That used to be a row of small rooms, each with its own story. Each person had her own little space." We passed under a railroad bridge and he pointed at a flat area and said, "There used to be a woman who ran the most well-known spot in the state right there." I finally laughed and said, "Guess I know what you spent your youth doing." Story 8. My mom was adopted and my grandparents never kept it a secret. They loved my mom like their own. When she was growing up, she tried to find out as much as she could about her and her adopted brother's birth parents. Back in those days, though, info like that wasn't exactly easy to find. My mom and uncle were brought to the orphanage with little to no info on their biological parents, or the information was otherwise requested to be kept secret. Eventually, my mom found enough info from notes she had gathered, like which families might have been most likely to be related to her, some property info one can find at the library, and she just sort of pieced this puzzle together over her life. At a certain point, she was able to get the names of her mother and her brother's mother. She found out she was part of a big family, with lots of brothers and sisters. But for my uncle, he found out that his mother had died not long after placing him for adoption. By the time she had gathered all of this info and found this much out, my mom was married, had my older sister, and was pregnant with me. I can't remember exactly what it was she found that led to it, or if she heard something from someone, but she got a phone number. That phone number went to the house of her biological mother. She called and the voice of a young boy answered. My mom asked for the name she knew and she hears, "Yeah, 1 second. Hey mom, phone's for you." My mom and her mom talked. It wasn't an easy conversation, and I'm just going to refer to my mom's mom as Bio Gran from here. Bio Gran was not comfortable with my mom contacting her at all. She didn't ask my mom a lot of questions, but my mom said she was just going to talk, and if Bio Gran wanted to hang up at any point, she could. My mom gave her a short version of the story of her life, and then the conversation was over. After that, Bio Gran would send letters to my mom on occasion, but she made it clear she could never be found out by the rest of her family. And Bio Gran carried that secret with her until the day of her death. One of her daughters asked her, "Will you tell us where you went when you went away that time?" And Biogran finally confessed. She had gone to a home for unwed mothers all those years ago to have my mom, the child of her affair. I've met two of my bio-aunts, and sadly both of them passed a few years ago. Story 9. My great-uncle had pancreatic cancer and was very frail because of it. I helped him bathe, use the restroom, and change him each morning. Not his last words to me, but something he said that has stuck with me since was, "I hate feeling so useless. I can't do this anymore. I'm so sorry you have to do this." I told him I never minded doing this for him. I loved him so much and I'd always be there for him. I had to move away a few weeks later because my mom wanted me back home, as I was living with my grandparents and him at the time. He passed away shortly after, and his cat, who he had for almost 30 years, died a few days after him. He was a good man. Story 10. My great-aunt passed away a couple of years ago. She was suffering from viral encephalitis and fluctuated in and out of consciousness. It was truly painful to watch. Although a lot of family tended to be around her in those last days, I once happened to be alone with her when she made some fairly odd remarks, which I kept to myself since. On the day in question, I was playing games on my phone in her hospital room when she started to audibly mutter to herself. It became more urgent and intense. Eventually, she explicitly called me to her side. Her eyes looked huge and confused. I doubt she knew who I was. She began to speak, most of her words barely comprehensible, putting particular emphasis on boy and ingredient. I sat there for 15 minutes, listening to her erratic account of, as I finally gathered, how she sometimes used to cook eggs using an unusual traditional method involving a stable boy. She insisted that he was handsomely compensated for his role, but now and then she started to cry and couldn't stop. I looked it up weeks later, and there indeed exists a traditional dish in China described in the West with a name that involves a specific age group. Apparently, this concept had fascinated her, and she had recreated it herself and served it to her family, sometimes including my younger self, without explaining what it was. I'm not sure if she felt shame or enthusiasm about this. She often stammered something about the secret ingredient, but it clearly haunted her toward the very end of her life. Story 11. I worked as a night janitor in the children's cancer ward at my local hospital. There was a little boy, about 6 years old, lying in bed, and he called me into his room because he wanted help adjusting his pillow. He was hooked up with wires and couldn't roll over to place the pillow how he wanted. Figuring I'd be allowed to help since a nurse wasn't really needed for that, I parked my cart outside the room and went in. In the room, he started asking me different questions about my job. The first was whether I was a nurse. I said no. He asked me if I had seen his mom in the hallway and told me she'd gone down to the cafeteria to get him strawberry milk and a donut. I said no to that too. He was quiet for a second. Then he looked me right in the face and said, "If I pass away soon, I hope that my mom is not sad." That hit me, like, really hard. This kid was completely aware that he could die and that his mother would be hurt by it. I didn't even know how to feel, so I told him that he wasn't going to pass away and that hundreds of people survive cancer, which sounds like a big number to someone that young. I left shortly after and broke down crying in the bathroom. A few days later, I was wiping down the wooden support railings along the walls of that hallway, and his room was closed for cleaning plus disinfection. That sign is only hung outside of rooms when someone passes away. Story 12. Not really confessions, but I recall two stories of deathbed conversations that stuck with me. One was my friend's grandpa, who was always known to be a loving but stern man. He used to drink and sleep a lot. On his deathbed, he asked my friend to come closer and told him, "I've left a lot of money to you. Life's not worth it. Spend it all. Spend it all on wild things." And he passed away about a week later. I don't know if my friend followed the advice exactly, but he did spend the money. The other story is about my grandma. She was always abused physically and emotionally by my grandfather. When she started showing signs of Alzheimer's, my grandpa escalated the abuse and began kicking and pinching her, so we took her in during her final months. On her deathbed, just a few days before she passed, my grandpa came to visit. He pinched her cheeks and messed with her, expecting no resistance. And then she had a moment of clarity and snapped. She swatted away his hand and shouted, "Stop it! I'm sick of you and your ways. Go, leave now. I don't ever want to see you again, not ever." She was always a sweet and cheerful woman, and watching her stand up for herself at last always makes me smile. Story 13. Around the time my grandfather was really declining, he started making strange remarks about a group of people we were unfamiliar with, a lot of war stories, and repeatedly mentioned the word kitchens. He kept talking about kitchens, and we just assumed it was rambling or confusion. After he passed, while cleaning out their house, we came across an old family book that was handwritten by his grandfather. It was about the Denver bootleggers, focusing on a certain character who ran one of the larger bootlegging operations in the area during Prohibition. Then we found some photos in a box with a bunch of pins and a sash that appeared to be from the Masons. The photos all had my grandfather and his father posing with family members, as well as a mysterious old man dressed in what could only be described as a 1940s-era suit and hat, making him look like an old-school gangster. We then discovered there was a house my aunt used to visit as a child, supposedly owned by that old man in the photos. When I looked into the property, it didn't have a registered number on the street where it sits. Instead, it's registered as an address one block over. The house has no official number and is owned by a company run by someone my aunt and mom know to be a relative. At this point, we think Kitchens was a code name for someone my grandfather was associated with in the Masons, and that this Kitchens figure may be the man in the photos, possibly even the inspiration for the main character in the handwritten book we found buried in the closet. Story 14. My nan used to give me daisies whenever I felt sick or upset, and I'd always give her daisies from the garden on her birthdays. Basically, daisies were our little gesture to show we cared about each other. I thought it was just between us, but when she was in the hospital, she told me the story behind them. Apparently, the love of her life ran a flower shop in Bristol. In Nan's first week in town, she was checking out all the shops in the downtown area of the city and came across that very flower shop. She talked to her love, the shop lady, for the first time that day. Nan ordered a bouquet of daisies because why not? The shop lady went to the back room to get the fresh daisies and they tripped over one another when she returned. Apparently, this was a real-life version of the trip and fall scenes because they fell and their lips touched. The daisies ended up all over the floor and in their hair. So they started seeing each other at the shops, they'd get malts, eat dinners, etc. But they never really became girlfriends. Nan knew she was in love, but also knew that relationships like theirs were not accepted at the time. So for her own safety, she never voiced her feelings. After a few years of the ladies getting along as close friends with feelings involved, the shop lady was diagnosed with cancer. Nan would bring her daisies at the hospital every day and would pray for her. But it was no use. Medical technology wasn't advanced enough to help her. Apparently, the two were talking together on the shop lady's last night of life. They finally confessed their love. One of the last things Nan said was, "Do you remember the time when we first met? With the daisies?" So sweet. I'll never look at daisies the same again. I miss my Nan a lot now. She probably wouldn't approve of the way my mom and dad act toward me now. Story 15. I worked with a hospice patient one time who had really intense delusions. Her main one was that she had met the actor Michael Landon about 20 years earlier at a telethon, and that he remembered her, found her in the nursing home, and they were to be married. Each telling was extremely detailed. For over a year, she told me all about Michael and their wedding plans, how someone named Haas was building them a beautiful ranch house. She put on makeup all the time to prepare for the wedding and described what she would wear and her flowers. But each time they were about to wed, she would tell me that some catastrophe had happened to prevent it. Like I said, this went on for over a year. One day I popped into her room and she told me she and Michael had finally gotten married that morning and she'd be moving into her new home. She passed away that night. Story 16. Not quite a deathbed confession. When I was in high school, I had a school project to interview someone interesting. I asked my dad for ideas and he arranged for me to interview his old radiation biology professor, now a quite elderly man. We talked about his work, which was very interesting, but then he began to discuss his World War II experiences. He was a sailor on a corvette in the North Atlantic, protecting convoys against U-boats. He talked about how the service was simultaneously really boring, physically difficult. It sounded like the weather was always bad and the corvettes bobbed about in the huge waves like corks, and also terrifying. But then he started telling me about a night when he was on watch. He got into a fight with a fellow sailor over nothing in particular, and the other sailor hit his head against the steel wall of the ship and was knocked unconscious. The professor said he was terrified he'd killed the man and would be punished for it. It was at night during a bad storm, and they were alone with no witnesses. To cover it up, he dragged the man to the side and simply pushed him into the water. The next day, the sailor was missed, of course, but everyone just assumed he had fallen overboard by accident during the storm. Apparently, this wasn't unheard of, and no one ever suspected the professor. I was pretty stunned by this revelation. The man was confessing to something serious he had done decades ago. Needless to say, that story did not make it into the school report. Story 17. When my partner had cancer, most of his 4 daughters from a previous marriage made it about them. One time they cooked some meals and brought them over. There were countless Facebook posts about how they made 20 meals for weeks afterward. They came to visit during treatment in another town and made it as difficult as possible for me to see him. They even told him not to cry because it upset them, and there were many other similar things. When he went into palliative care, he didn't want to tell them at first. After a week, he asked me to let them know. They all arrived with partners and kids. They were upset they couldn't stay with us. All 15 of them, they blamed me for keeping them away from their dad, saying, quote, "They were there first, and it's their special time as a family." Their special time consisted of sitting in the same room as him all day, talking and laughing among themselves, ignoring their dad, and waking him up during the day because they thought he wouldn't sleep that night. An hour before he died, my partner's last words were, "We should never have told them I was dying. It would be so much easier without them here, and I hate how they treat you." By the way, 3 are not mine. My first wife had lots of affairs. Call me harsh, but I wish they had heard every word. Story 18. My husband's grandmother was a difficult person. Maybe she hadn't done anything criminal, but she was racist, materialistic, and deeply self-centered. Nobody wanted to visit her in the nursing home. I did, but only because it was close to my house, and I've always found human behavior interesting. I was never cruel to her, but I definitely shared my opinions about her way of thinking. She didn't like me. On one particular day, she told me she didn't want to be on Earth anymore, just like she said at every visit. This time, I asked her if she really meant it. She said, "Yes, pray for me to die." She knew I wasn't religious, but knew I believed in something beyond us. I said, "I can't ask something like that. This is your life and your decision." She replied, "But I have prayed for it, and nothing happens." I explained that if it were me, I'd ask the universe to take me, but I wouldn't do it unless I knew deep down it was my truth. She passed away that evening. In all the final visits I had with her, she never showed remorse or changed her disposition. She was as bitter and unkind as the day I met her. Story 19. This is a bedside confession, the only one I ever gave to my grandma. I grew up in Florida near my dad's parents, who were both educated. My dad's mom was an English teacher, and his dad had a doctorate in theology. They did mission work abroad for nearly 60 years. They were fairly worldly people and had a big influence on me as a kid. My mom's mother lived in South Carolina her whole life. She dropped out in the 6th grade and never had much formal education. She left my mom's dad, a man battling serious mental health issues, back in the 60s and worked as a housekeeper her entire life. The cultural clash between my dad's family and my mom's was definitely real. In the 80s, when I was about 10, we visited my grandmother in South Carolina for the summer. It was hot, and she told me to roll up the glass. Since I was used to more proper speech, I asked her why she said glass instead of roll up the window. Being a bit self-conscious, she went off on me, telling me not to question her, that she knew my other grandmother was educated, and launched into a full rant. Looking back, I realize I was kind of insensitive at times. There were a few occasions like that, but this one stuck with me. Fast forward to 2017. She was bedridden and not doing well. I had thought about that moment over the years, and while visiting her, I explained that she wasn't wrong. You don't roll up the whole window, it's just the glass you're moving. By that time, she had forgotten the incident, but we had a good laugh. It felt good to give her that win. She passed away in 2019 at the age of 90. Story 20. Okay, so this involves some spiritual, paranormal stuff that people might not believe, but it's still a cool story, so bear with me. Technically not a confession, but the last conversation she had with my parents. My great-grandma passed when I was 12. She took care of my mom instead of her actual mother and lived with us because none of her sons or daughters would take care of her. So we were the ones who stayed with her during the year when her health declined. She had Alzheimer's, and it progressed really fast, so she constantly snapped in and out of consciousness. It was easy to tell because her eyes weren't focused most of the time. A week or so before she passed, she told my mom that someone had visited her. At first, we thought she was confused and didn't remember who my mom was, until she said, fully focused, "It was my mom. She came here to see if everything was fine." At that point, we knew she didn't have much time left. My mom is very connected to spiritual things. She's seen things, she knows a bit, and she's told me that people often get visited by loved ones who've passed to make sure they're calm and ready. That same week, her decline was faster. She barely talked. She just wasn't there anymore. One of the last things she said was to my dad. He was sitting with her when she suddenly became alert and told him, "Take care of them for me, okay?" He told her that he would. It wasn't even a question. Then she faded again. Bonus part of the story. A year or two ago, a family friend passed. She had been friends with my great-grandma. My parents went to visit her because she didn't have much time left. My mom and this woman had a meaningful conversation, even though she was also fading in and out of consciousness. At one point, her eyes suddenly locked in, and both my parents froze, because it looked exactly like my great-grandma's gaze. She looked at my mom and told her several times how much she loved her, then turned to my dad and asked, "Are you taking care of them?" She asked him twice. He still gets irritated about it to this day because he felt like she was questioning whether he was doing a good job or didn't trust him. He actually gets angry when we bring up the story. Story 21. Not quite sure if this qualifies as a deathbed confession, but when my mother was a little girl in school, she was given the job of getting the writing chalk, this was back in the days of writing on slate, from a high shelf. Unfortunately, she dropped it. She picked up all the chalk, but didn't notice that one piece had fallen inside her vest. Later that evening, when her mother was undressing her for bed, the chalk fell out. She was severely punished for stealing and was never forgiven. It weighed on her for the rest of her life, the feeling of injustice. So much so that when her mother was on her deathbed, my mother didn't want her to go thinking her daughter was a thief. She said, "I really didn't steal the chalk," only to hear the response, "Yes, you did." My mother told me this story only a few years before she passed, and it made me feel incredibly sad for her. Please don't get the idea that her mother was heartless. It was just how things were back then, during the years between the wars. Story 22. This isn't my story. It's from my father-in-law. His father was a wild man. He was imprisoned during our country's military dictatorship and tortured for selling books. A much more damaged man came out of prison than the one who had gone in. He didn't kill or commit violent crimes, but he did steal from the wealthy, used every substance he could get, cheated on his wife, and eventually divorced her. He used to steal cars and drive them to Paraguay, where he'd sell them. He also controlled illegal gambling operations. He was both chaotic and charming, and despite everything, he was a great father. But when he was around 35 to 40 years old, he contracted hepatitis. He spent the rest of his life in terrible pain, confined to a hospital bed. Thankfully, we have free health care. When he realized his time was running out, he said he didn't regret anything. If he had the chance to do it all over again, he'd only change one thing. He would never have divorced my father-in-law's mother, Virginia. He passed away asking for her forgiveness. Story 23. I heard my grandpa's deathbed confession. I was alone with him. It was late at the hospital and his heart rate was dropping. I could feel it, and so could he. His time was very close. He squeezed my hand and said, "You always said you could keep a secret, so keep this one." That fishing spear I kept. The super old one I said I sold for a lot. It was fake. The cash is in the third book. That was all he said, or pretty close. He looked up, chuckled, and within the hour he was gone. He was right though. I went looking through his bookshelves. No luck. But when I checked the basement, I found it. The cash. I felt bad taking it, but I wanted to make sure the money was used for something he'd be proud of. I kept it for a while, but eventually decided that the best thing to do was buy a boat. A nice old wooden one. I bought it with a loan I was able to get, and I named the boat after him. I take it out fishing and do all sorts of things I know he would have loved. I hope he's looking down, and I hope he likes my decision. He loved fishing and the sea itself, so I'm pretty sure he's smiling up there. I love you, Gramps. Rest well. Story 24. Not exactly related, since my granddad didn't really have a deathbed confession. He slipped into unresponsiveness about a week before he passed. Cancer, thou art a heartless force. I do think I played some small part in his passing, though. My mom and grandma visited him every day in hospice care, basically every hour. I FaceTime my mom every night, and one time I happened to call when she was with Granddad. She asked if I could call back later. I said sure, of course. Then I raised my voice and said, "Hi, Granddad. I love you. Let me know how chocolate tastes in the afterlife." He loved chocolate, but lost his sense of taste during the last year of his life. He died that night. After a week of no change in his condition, he passed just a few hours after I told him I loved him. I feel him with me every once in a while, especially when I'm with my mom. I hope he's proud of us. Still waiting to hear how astral chocolate tastes, though. Story 25. My grandpa was in the military, so my dad decided to follow in his footsteps and join the Air Force after graduating high school. He was in for 6 years. He always had this sense of pride, thinking his dad was happy he'd followed the same path. But on my grandpa's deathbed, he told my dad, "I didn't want you to join the military, you know." My dad was confused and said, "But I always thought you were so proud of me." My grandpa replied, "I was. I just hated the thought of you leaving. Anytime you were away from home in the service, I would fall into a bad depression until you came back." It blew my dad's mind. All this time he thought he had done what his father wanted, but it was actually the last thing he wanted. He also randomly told my dad, "I hate when you wear those tight socks." My dad said, "What? You can't even see my socks." My grandpa replied, "You always wear tight socks. I hate them." My dad just wears regular crew socks, no tighter than normal, but apparently my grandpa really didn't like them. Story 26. It wasn't exactly a deathbed confession, as when he was actually on his deathbed, he was completely incoherent and mostly unconscious. But before he went in for the surgery that ultimately led to his passing, my father told me that I had good instincts, that I was right about who he truly was, and that while my mother is a good woman, his words, she was dead wrong about him, always has been, and always will be. See, my father was convicted of serious crimes against children and was sentenced to 25 to 50 years. He was released at the lower end of that sentence only because he was too ill to pose a threat anymore. But my mother had always raised me to believe he was the most amazing person in the world, that he could do no wrong, and that he had been unfairly punished. A lie I fully believed until the day I saw the DNA results on my niece, who also happens to be my half-sister. That day, everything changed. In that final conversation, he basically admitted what he had done. Story 27. My grandfather passed away about 2 years ago from complications related to Hodgkin's lymphoma. He was on a ventilator and still only at about 91% oxygen. To make a long story short, he was very tired of fighting. He asked the doctors if he could be given enough morphine to be put to sleep and then removed from the ventilator so he could pass peacefully. We were with him at the hospital for one last conversation before they administered the medication. I remember walking over to him, grabbing his hand, and thanking him for being such an inspiration in my life. I thanked him for showing me what it means to be a good man, honest and responsible. He squeezed my hand, smiled, and told me he was proud of who I was becoming. His last words to me were to take care of myself and to try to be kind every day. Since then, I've done my best to live by those words. Story 28. Back in 2011, my best friend passed away by suicide at my apartment while I was out of town visiting family for Easter weekend. He had been going through a lot and struggling with depression. I had asked him to watch my cat and take care of a few things while I was gone. I don't remember his last text word for word, but they were something like, "I just want all my friends to get along, and love you, bro." Our close-knit friend group had all moved from our hometown to a bigger city about 100 miles south, and although we all lived nearby, we had drifted apart over petty disagreements. It still eats at me that I was a little short with him before leaving. He said goodbye, and I replied something like, "Don't give me that. I'll be back in a couple days. Just hang out and take it easy." He kept texting me while I was on the road to visit my family, and sometime later that night, he used everything I had left behind in one go. I spent the weekend frantically trying to reach him. I couldn't leave. I didn't have a car, and when I got home, I had to scale an electrical conduit to break into my apartment. I found him on the couch, cold and still. It was the worst day of my life. Story 29. A bit off topic, but I'm the sole witness of a funeral confession about the nature of my grandfather's birth. My grandfather was a difficult, abusive man. Throughout his life, he claimed that his eldest sister was actually his biological mother. His cousins, and later his children, just assumed it was a sign of his mental instability. While undiagnosed, I personally believe he may have had paranoid schizophrenia. He simply wasn't a reliable narrator. Fast forward to his funeral. I was at a fully packed service with our large extended family in attendance. A random elderly woman I didn't recognize pulled me aside. Sobbing, she began speaking to me in Spanish. Since I was raised in the U.S. and speak mostly English, I said, "I'm sorry, ma'am, I can't understand you. I'm so sorry." She held my hands tightly, and even though I didn't know what she was saying, I figured the least I could do was let her cry it out. Then she looked into my eyes and said clear as day, "He was my son. I am his mother." Her accent was thick, but those were the only words she repeated to me in English. At the time, we were complete strangers. After she walked away, I went to my aunt and told her what happened. She replied, "Oh, she's just crazy. Don't pay any attention to her." A year and a half later, I was vacationing with my parents in my mother's home country. We were staying with extended family, primarily her aunt on her father's side. She was kind and bright, a retired lawyer. She spoke a few words of English, but mostly communicated through my mom. After a few days, it struck me. She was the woman I had seen at the funeral. I told my stepfather what happened, and he said, "No, don't repeat that to anybody. Where'd you hear that from?" I was confused. I hadn't heard it from anyone else. That really happened. So he told me the family story. According to relatives from the older generation, my grandfather's older aunts and uncles used to tease him with claims that he was the result of an incident involving his eldest sister and a first cousin. Supposedly, she became pregnant in her teens and the pregnancy was hidden. Her mother claimed the baby as her own to avoid scandal. This is what was told to me. I can't verify the facts. It's all based on rumors and secondhand stories going back more than 70 years. The details may be inaccurate, filtered through gossip and disbelief. Considering my grandfather's reputation as an unreliable narrator and his sister's respected status, I understand why many dismiss the story. Today, only my parents and siblings know about what that woman told me. My mother chooses not to believe it. Personally, I think that woman grieved the loss of her son and needed to confide in a stranger. I don't wish to spread rumors, so while she's still alive, I'll refrain from telling extended family. Also, I want to be clear. I don't believe mental illness makes someone a bad person. My grandfather wasn't abusive because he was ill. He made his own choices. Story 30. My grandmother was always a very bitter and self-centered woman. She got pregnant with my aunt before marrying my grandfather. They married, had my mother, and stayed together, though not affectionately. Years passed. My aunt and mom moved out, and my grandfather moved into my aunt's old room. They slept separately. It wasn't questioned too much. Older people sometimes have trouble sleeping, and my grandmother was said to be a heavy snorer. About 10 years ago, my grandfather started acting strangely and repeating himself. It turned out to be colon cancer that had spread to his bones and brain. Within 6 months, he went from hospital to hospice to passing. My grandmother was surprisingly cold about it. After he died, she kept nothing of his but his recliner. She even got angry at my mother for wanting to keep his wedding ring, accusing her of trying to pawn it for money. Over the next 8 years, my grandmother remained demanding, rude, and emotionally difficult with both my aunt and mother. She occasionally had mini-strokes that made her confused for short periods. During one of these spells, she mentioned a man my mom had never heard of before. That tipped my mom off. There was something she hadn't shared. Turns out, she had been married before my grandfather. Some family members knew and even had old wedding photos. She had the marriage annulled about a year before she met my grandfather. When asked about it, she would completely deny it and change the subject. Then one day, my mom and aunt got a call. She was in the hospital and not doing well. Her kidneys were failing, and she'd likely had another mini-stroke. During a conversation with them, she turned to my mom and said, "You're right. I was married before. I loved him. We got married. And soon after, he quit his job and wanted me to support him by doing things I wasn't willing to do. I couldn't believe it, so I left him. I just didn't want to talk about it. It still hurts." She didn't say much more. My mom and aunt left the hospital, and about 8 hours later, she passed away. It makes me wonder, Maybe that early experience is what made her so closed off and unhappy. It always seemed like she married my grandfather because he could provide for her. He always worked, she never did. And I never once saw them hug, let alone kiss. It really makes you think. Story 31. My paternal grandfather passed due to complications from Alzheimer's. I wasn't there for his final moments, but the last time I saw him was memorable. It was my grandfather, grandmother, father, and I in the common area of the facility where he was staying. During the conversation, he thought my grandmother was different people at various moments. Once he believed she was one of his sisters who had passed in the 90s, and another time he thought she was his own mother who had passed in the 70s. When my Nana told him she was his wife, there was a flicker of recognition, and he softly said, "Oh, heavens," which is probably the closest I ever heard him come to cursing. We did most of the talking, just telling him about our days. From what I remember, his mental faculties were mostly intact. He could understand me talking about the new bike I'd just gotten, but he didn't necessarily remember that I was his grandson. The only other thing I clearly remember from that day was him softly humming an old hymn that had always been one of his favorites, and my Nana joining in, singing in harmony. They were both wonderful musicians and had played in local orchestras for most of their adult lives. I always remembered him being the most present when music was involved. After the hymn, he said, "Oh, that was wonderful, Wendy." Wendy being my grandmother's real name. There was no dramatic confession, just a warm memory. He was a good man who did all he could to help, teach, encourage, and bring joy to others. I miss him. Story 32. My great-grandmother was a fountain of knowledge and loved her family fiercely. We all loved hearing her stories about life in the late 1800s and early 1900s. At age 99, she decided it was time to go into a care home to give the kids a break. She was sharp as ever mentally, but confined to a wheelchair due to bad hips. We always knew she was the first person in her county to have a telephone and used to take and relay messages for neighbors. I always suspected she had lived through a lot more than she told us during her 105 years. She used to share stories with local elementary school kids who interviewed her for school projects, like how she remembered exercise being stripping logs to build your own home. By the time she neared the end, she had a dozen or more great-great-grandchildren. Mine was the only one she hadn't met. I flew in for 3 weeks and brought my 7-month-old daughter with me. When I went to see her, she called me by my aunt's name and said how precious my aunt's baby was. It stung that she didn't recognize us, but we'd made it just in time. She got to see her last great-great-grandchild before passing. She died a few days later. The nurses told us she had held on longer than expected because she knew I was coming and wanted to meet the baby. Once she had, she was at peace. They also told us how she'd demand a glass of beer and a cigar, saying, "One won't kill me." And George, her much older, now deceased husband, used to get a kick out of smoking one with me. In her less lucid moments, she'd shout suffragette slogans and curse like a sailor, something none of us kids had ever heard. The suffragette part surprised the entire family, but we loved it. Of course, she had fought for women's right to vote. She was a firecracker. The nurses admitted they had held back some stories because they didn't want to shock or upset the family. I bet every word was true. At the memorial, my daughter kept staring over my shoulder, giggling and playing peekaboo by burying her face in my shoulder and popping back up to grin. She wouldn't let me turn her around or sit down. She just kept playing. My then husband, in a harsh voice, said, "Can't you quiet her down or take her outside? She's disrupting the memorial." The whole family glared at him, especially my dad, who looked ready to tell him off. Just then, the preacher stepped in and said that my great-grandmother would have loved to hear those giggles, that she'd be playing peekaboo with my daughter right now if she were here, just like she used to with all the church babies. That's when it hit me. She was there. She had finally met and recognized her last great-great-grandbaby. I'll never forget her, and I'll always wish I had listened to more of her stories. Story 33. This is a true story, though very hard to believe. An older, poor Irish couple I once knew, they would be at least in their 90s if still alive, had a baby at a rural hospital. The baby was born with some sort of severe genetic deformity and was declared dead shortly after birth. The doctor told them, "Sorry, but you should never have another baby. They'll likely have the same condition." So they went through life childless. Many years later, when they were in their 50s or 60s and living in California, they received a call out of the blue. It was from their son. Apparently on her deathbed, an elderly nun had confessed to being part of a tragic cover-up. She had been the nurse on duty the night their baby was born. Healthy. That same night, a wealthy couple had a baby born with severe deformities who sadly passed away. The husband of the wealthy couple bribed the doctor to switch the babies. The couple was devastated but immediately liquidated everything and moved back to Ireland, where they finally met not only their son, but also their grandchildren. Story 34. I was on a business trip when I got the call that my dad, who had cancer but wasn't seeking treatment, had collapsed. He was on life support, and I had to fly to my hometown as quickly as possible. When I arrived at the hospital and saw him with all the tubes and machines, it was tough. Although we had a tumultuous relationship, it still hit hard. But I stayed strong to support my sister and stepmom. They'd married while I was in college. The doctors told us he had no brain function and that decisions needed to be made. We quickly agreed that he wouldn't have wanted to remain in that state, so they removed life support. They had warned us he wasn't an active participant in the breathing test, so it would likely only be a few minutes. But that tough old guy just kept breathing, snoring actually. This went on for hours. Late that night, I offered to stay overnight with him so everyone else could get some rest. 13.5 hours after the breathing tube was removed, and with no change, just continued snoring, I told the nurse, "Maybe he wants to be alone. Please come get me if anything changes." I went to the lounge. 10 minutes later, the nurse came to get me. I was there for his final breaths. At one point, he stopped breathing for about 45 seconds. It felt like forever. As his heart rate slowed, I touched his arm and said, "I love you, Dad." Immediately, he sat bolt upright, eyes wide open, and let out the biggest gasp of breath I've ever heard. Then he fell back onto the bed and passed a few minutes later. It scared the life out of me. After his passing, I found out he had intentionally left the house and taken his tractor next door to get fuel, though it didn't actually need any. While talking to two friends, he randomly said, "You know, my dad knew when he was going to die. Like he knew that day he was going to die." Moments later, he collapsed from a heart attack. He had a DNR and clearly didn't want to pass away in the home his wife would continue living in. Unfortunately, a medic arrived before the ambulance and, unaware of the DNR, started CPR. It was a heartbreaking but incredibly selfless thing to do in his final moments, to try to spare his loved ones that memory. Thanks for letting me share this. I've never told my sister or stepmom the full details beyond saying he passed peacefully. I bore the weight of that terrifying experience alone. No reason to make them carry it too. Story 35. In my area, older generations believe strongly in supernatural or heavenly intervention in everyday life. That belief gradually faded by the time my generation came around. My mother used to tell these stories that, to my curious young mind, sounded both fascinating and a bit made up. So, when I reached my mid-teens, I would often corner some of my aunts or uncles, people from my mother's side, when she wasn't around, and try to get them to share their own versions of these tales. To my surprise, their stories were almost word for word the same. I even overheard a casual conversation between two uncles one day where one of those stories came up, and they both recalled the exact same details without knowing I was already familiar with it. That's the background. I'll share two short stories out of those I've heard. The first was about my mother's grand uncle, who was on his deathbed in their old bricked house under a dim light bulb. He looked toward it, and his expression changed suddenly. He said, "Why is there a cat sitting on that light bulb?" Everyone turned in that direction, but there was nothing there. Still, he looked completely convinced and added, "This cat is staring right at me." He passed away not long after, though I don't know the exact time between. Another story is about another grand uncle from my mother's extended family. He was a very kind, devout man, beloved in his village. When he was on his deathbed, many people came to see him and pay their respects. At one point, he looked to his side and said, "Oh, my brother, you? It's been so long, so good to see you. And you too? What a lovely surprise." He then began introducing the guests to others in the room, but there was no one in the chairs next to him. The people he mentioned had all passed away long ago. He died shortly after. There are a few others, some slightly scarier, which I also witnessed, but I choose to call them coincidences. Still, experiences like these are why I consider myself agnostic. Story 36. This isn't exactly a deathbed confession, but before my granny entered her final phase, she shared something personal with me. She told me she felt guilty for my dad's behavior and believed he should have been more grateful for having me and my sister. After the divorce, my older sister and I chose not to see our mother again, and our other sister didn't want to see our dad. A lot happened between them. Even though my granny was dealing with dementia, she was aware of how my dad had treated us and told me openly that she believed he hadn't always been good to us. She said she could feel her time was near. In her knees, she joked. Despite her condition, she remained self-aware and had trouble remembering some of her grandchildren, but not me. She said it was because I genuinely loved seeing her. My dad never had to force me to visit her, and she appreciated that I never had the family ego. Then came what I think of as her real confession. After our emotional conversation, she told me that if she had another clear moment, she'd pretend to be more confused than she was, especially around my dad or aunt. She wanted to say goodbye properly, but in a way that would protect herself emotionally. She also told me that I was her favorite, because I was always the one who had been left out. Then she asked for a cigarette. I gave it to her and stayed close, because she joked, "I'll set the building on fire." She wanted a hug and told me, "It's going to be okay. You'll be fine." She treated everyone fairly, but she always gave people what she believed they truly deserved. Story 37. My great-grandma was the glue that held my dad's side of the family together. My aunt still says things haven't been the same since she passed. Too much drama now. She was getting very sick around the time my mom was pregnant with me, but she kept fighting, determined to stick around long enough to meet me. I was my dad's first and only child, so it meant a lot to her. She kept that promise. She lived until I was about 5 months old, then passed away. To this day, I wish I had known her better. Everyone says she was the sweetest. I don't usually believe in the paranormal, but when I was 4 years old, I saw an old lady sitting on my bed, smoking a cigarette. She had long fingernails and kept saying how much she loved me and how grown I'd become. I ran into my parents' room and described her perfectly, even though I had never seen a picture of her and still haven't. My dad was completely freaked out because I described his grandmother in exact detail. He also swore he could smell cigarette smoke when he came back into my room. My mom was so spooked that she removed the cross hanging over my bed, thinking it might be something sinister trying to fool us. We're not religious at all, so that reaction was completely out of character. To this day, I think it was a dream, but my parents aren't so sure. Story 38. My father passed away at 55. He had been in the hospital due to blood clotting issues. I went to visit him, and my ex-wife and kids came up to see him with me. They left early because my kids were all under the age of 6, and the hospital wasn't exactly an easy place to keep them entertained. About 2 hours later, my ex texted me saying the car wouldn't start, and they were stranded in the mall parking lot nearby. I explained the situation to my dad, and he simply said, "Go take care of your family." He said it so casually, but those were the last words he ever said to me. He passed away the next day. What struck me was how meaningful that moment was. For the last 5 years, I had been juggling being there for him while also caring for my wife and kids. He had been in and out of the hospital during that time. It was almost like he knew it was time and gave me permission to stop worrying about him. He never wanted to be a burden, but I never saw him as one. I'd take care of him for another 20 years if it meant just one more day with him. Story 39. So, not a dramatic family secret or anything like that, but still meaningful. My stepdad, who was also my father's partner, started to get sick in 2015. It began with severe anorexia that led to organ failure. Eventually, he developed lung cancer, despite never smoking, and what seemed to be early onset dementia. No one could really explain everything that was happening. There were several close calls before he finally passed in 2019. One of those almost moments was in 2017. I went to visit him in the hospital. I wasn't doing too well myself. I was struggling with a relapse of my own eating disorder and was about to be sent to rehab in Florida. I sat at the edge of his bed and told him I felt like a disappointment. Up until that point, he'd been mumbling incoherently, but as soon as I said that, he suddenly responded with perfect clarity. "You were never a disappointment." Then he seemed to slip back into the fog. His body held on for another 2 years. I was on the other side of the country when he eventually passed from pneumonia, but I still think about what he said to me that night. I've been in recovery ever since that hospitalization in Florida. Story 40. My dad was an egomaniac. He never admitted when he was wrong, even when faced with overwhelming evidence. He was also religious to an extreme degree and believed that anyone who didn't agree with him was destined for hell. He insisted he was completely healthy, doing everything right, and that if he died, it would be because of others. He didn't believe in mental health. He thought it was an excuse people used to avoid responsibility. Ironically, the only modern concept he acknowledged was climate change. I was his favorite child. For a long time, I didn't see the full picture. When he began to weaken due to an illness, details of which I don't fully remember, he was rushed to the ER. That's when we learned he had stage 4 cancer. It was the result of years of unhealthy drinking, soda, junk food, and smoking 2 packs of cigars a day. On his deathbed, he told me, "The only reason I was like this was because I was afraid to accept change." He admitted that things like LGBTQ+ rights, atheism, technology, and mental health awareness overwhelmed him. It was all too new, and he didn't know how to adjust. He lived most of his life in denial. Looking back now, I try my best to be everything he wasn't. Story 41. I'm the only one who remembers this, but I have a vivid memory of seeing my great-grandmother in hospice when I was very young. For context, my grandma didn't get along with her mother and was very protective of me. My great-grandmother had what I now assume was severe dementia, or Alzheimer's. When we visited, she kept yelling, asking who I was, which upset everyone and scared me. At one point, she asked me for my stuffed animal dog. I started crying because I didn't want to give it to her. My grandma stepped in firmly and told me not to, but my great-grandmother asked again, and my mom quickly took me out of the room. I remember hearing screaming behind us and then all of us leaving the facility in a rush. My grandma looked shaken afterward. I wish I could ask her what happened in that room, but she passed away unexpectedly about 11 years ago. From what I've gathered over the years, Great-Grandma Utana's last words were screams, and judging by how the rest of the family spoke of her, it didn't seem like anyone was mourning too deeply. Story 42. My boyfriend's grandpa had terminal cancer for 2 years. It started in his lungs and eventually spread to his brain, forming a tumor and continued spreading throughout his body. The brain tumor caused seizures in his legs, which led to frequent hospital visits. The seizures were painful and prevented him from sleeping. We were in the hospital with him one day, and my boyfriend took his grandma to get something to eat. I stayed in the room with his grandpa. He was extremely out of it due to lack of sleep, medication, and, of course, the tumor. He didn't realize I was in the room and began whispering to himself, "Make it stop. I want to die," over and over again. It broke my heart to hear that. His daughter had been pushing him to continue with aggressive rounds of chemo to prolong his life, despite his own wishes to just let go peacefully. He passed away a couple of months after that day. I haven't told my boyfriend or his family what I heard. I want them to keep believing that his grandfather stayed strong and hopeful until the very end. I think that's the version of him they need to remember. Story 43. I always knew my granny was a complicated woman, but last year she had a sudden fall, broke her hip, and very quickly began to lose her mental clarity. Before all of this happened, she always claimed to absolutely adore us. Once she came home from the hospital, 2 people none of the family had ever heard of suddenly became constant fixtures at her side. We couldn't really spend time with her without them being present and watching every move. We weren't sure if she truly welcomed their presence or not, but she had clearly invited them into her life at some point before. Over the following months, things became incredibly stressful. These 2 people kept pushing hard for her to rewrite her will and were repeatedly urging the family to get her in front of a solicitor as soon as possible, insisting it had to be done before her condition worsened. As things went on, we began to feel like we had no idea what she actually wanted. It seemed this pair had convinced her, either intentionally or unintentionally, that her own family was the enemy. After her passing, we read through some of her letters and messages and discovered she had been mentally struggling far longer than we had realized. In her writings, she accused us of abandoning her and even of stealing from her, weeks and months before her fall. Ironically, after her death, we found out that she had taken quite a bit from others herself. She had never followed through on her late husband's will and had simply claimed all of his assets in her own name. We'll never know if she was confused, overwhelmed, or just being manipulative. I guess she'll always remain something of a mystery to us.